If Washington changes its hostile stance towards Moscow, Russia would return to full compliance with the New START deal, according to Russian news media citing Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister. In response to Moscow's ongoing violations of the agreement, the United States announced earlier this week that it will stop sending Russia with some notifications required under the Arms Control Pact, such as updates on the positions of its missile and launchers. Ryabkov asserts that Moscow was not taken aback by the action and that Russia's decision to suspend the New START deal will stand in the face of any retaliation. The TASS news agency quoted him as saying, "Regardless of any measures or countermeasures from the U.S. side, our decision to suspend the START treaty is unshakable. And our own condition for returning to a fully operational treaty is for the U.S. to abandon its fundamentally hostile stance toward Russia." Petraeus also said that Ukrainians are determined to liberate all of its territory. Well, they are quite categorical that winning for them is liberating all their territory. There's no hedging on that. There are no discussions behind closed doors that, oh look, we could give this up or give that up. They are determined to liberate their country. And again, to win the war and then win the peace. And of course, there will need to be some kind of, I think, some kind of negotiated resolution. We certainly don't ever want to see another frozen conflict with new front lines. And there's a lot of pressure on Russia. Petraeus also said Putin could hang on in power once the war with Ukraine is over. He has still total control. Certainly, there's some criticism of the Ministry of Defense, Defense Minister Shoigu, the Chief of the General Staff Gen Gerasimov and so forth. That's allowable. No one criticizes Putin or not generally. There has been some somewhat indirect by Prigozhin, by a few others. I think he probably could hang on to that power. And what we have to watch for are any indicators that the inconceivable, the toppling of Putin, could all of a sudden seem very possible. Petraeus also spoke to the Today program about the possibility of Ukraine retaking Crimea. I do tend to think that they, Ukraine, will cut this ability of the Russians to resupply Crimea along the southeast coast. They will sever that line of communication and begin the process of isolating Crimea as well. However, when asked if he thought they would take Crimea, he said, "Not in this counteroffensive. No. But if they can get to the point of beginning to isolate Crimea, I think that changes the dynamics very, very substantially. It couldn't even prompt Putin to start to consider a negotiated resolution. You know, right now, of course, he thinks that the Russians still are going to be able to outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans, and we have to do everything we can to enable the Ukrainians to prove him wrong." We've got more from Petraeus, who said he believed U.S. support for Ukraine would continue in the event of a Republican president. If you look at what was done in the debt ceiling agreement the other day, there's a little bit of fine print that says that they will revisit issues having to do with aid for Ukraine. In other words, that is not going to prevent them from doing more for Ukraine. There's very strong bipartisan support for Ukraine. I think that will continue, and there's going to be a big effort to make sure that those in the part of the Republican Party that have questioned aid for Ukraine, to persuade them that is a bad idea, frankly. And now if this offensive succeeds the way I think that it can and likely will, that will be a huge boast. More from Petraeus, who also said that joining NATO was required, but the language to reach this had to be ironclad. The big, looming issue right now has to do with the language on a path to NATO membership for Ukraine that will be announced at the July 11 Vilnius NATO summit. That should be as ironclad as absolutely possible. Obviously, they're not going to become a member while the war is still going on. But that is going to be crucial. Even Henry Kissinger, who cautioned against NATO membership for countries that were former Russian republics, has now concluded that this is indeed inevitable. It's required. NATO's security now rests on the border between Ukraine and Russia, as we've seen. You can't arm Ukraine the way that we have and not see that as again, integral to our security. But I think that the support will continue.